Hi, everyone. Over the course of the 2024-2025 season of Teaching Matters, we've had several discussions about productive uses of artificial intelligence in the classroom. Those have ranged from how it can be used in reading instruction to also how it can be used to track absenteeism, and of course, even applications of how AI could assist teachers in talking with family to give them updates on students. Oddly enough, we have not had a single discussion of what is perhaps the most obvious application of AI, which is the use of it in teaching mathematics. We're going to overcome that gap in our programming today by talking about that very topic on Teaching Matters.
Welcome to Teaching Matters, a podcast exploring all things teaching and learning. Teaching Matters is produced by NPR affiliate WOUB Public Media in Athens, Ohio. And here is your host, Dr. Scott Titsworth, Dean of the Scripps College of Communication at Ohio University.
My guest today is Nigel Nesbitt. He's the Vice President of Content Creation at the Mind Research Institute in Irvine, California. In previous positions, Nigel served as a math teacher in the LA Unified School District and also has the distinction of being a true rock star guitarist in an English rock band. You might remember, if you've listened to previous years of this podcast, Nigel was a guest approximately on November 11th of 2022, where we first met him. Nigel, it's great to have you back on the show, and thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Scott. Love to be back. Thank you very much.
So it has been a few years. We both have probably a few more gray hairs, but I think because of that time difference, I'd like to start just by having you talk about what the mission of the Mind Institute is and how you all sort of approach the idea of teaching and learning a bit differently than maybe other people do.
Yes, I think that is very relevant even then to our discussion of AI. So absolutely, I think that's a good place to start. So Mind grew out of neuroscience research into this whole topic of really thinking about how do we learn. So not so much how do we teach, which obviously was a question which I spent many years trying to figure out for myself. But it's really this shift of how do we learn? What's that neuroscience? How do our brains actually work really well in a learning capacity? And there are big differences between the traditional way that we teach and actually the way that our brains are very much wired to learn. And a lot of that then revolves around we are really well set up as human beings to learn by doing stuff. We are really good at learning from trying things, seeing why they did work, seeing why they didn't work, failing and sort of looping round. So Mind has then obviously built all kinds of programs and things and materials based upon that kind of concept. One of which being ST-Math with Gigi the Penguin, which is a sort of learning system for K-8 mathematics, actually pre-K-8 mathematics, which enables kids to try stuff, to figure stuff out for themselves. And the other sort of critical feature, if you like, of what we do is that everything is heavily visual. So one of the sort of, if you like, big ahas is that certainly spatial reasoning, and the ST in ST-Math stands for spatial temporal. So this neuroscience research into spatial reasoning and the applications of it then in the learning process sort of have led to a real focus on students being the ones who are doing the figuring out and the problem solving, and a heavy emphasis on visual tools as a way of kind of almost bypassing some of the language blockers, if you like, to the learning process and getting right in, getting kids thinking, getting them learning. So we've been using technology to try and unlock that learning process now for quite some time. And I've been with Mind now for over 15 years, building games, designing, doing R&D, kind of digging into that process. And our mission really is to sort of help all children. Our stated mission is to sort of solve the world's most challenging problems, to equip them mathematically to do that. So we're very big on problem solving, very big on kids figuring stuff out for themselves, and using technological tools to do that. So big picture background, but that's kind of where we are.
And quickly, we had a really fascinating discussion, 3 years ago about, sort of the perspective on neuroscience. A lot of listeners, maybe if they didn't listen to that podcast, then they may not understand sort of how that term applies to the notion of learning. Can you give a brief rundown of what you mean by that?
Sure. I think it's very easy sometimes when sort of thinking about neuroscience research and learning to get hung up on sort of, response times in synapse sort of things. That's not what we're talking about. That doesn't, I mean, that can be useful and obviously that has distinct applications. But when you're talking about learning, teachers, what do I do tomorrow in the classroom? How is this research actually going to help and benefit me? We're thinking more about, okay, there is a body of work out there that says that at the end of the day, as humans, we don't learn effectively by trying to learn lists of things. Our brains actually learn by making webs of things. Like neural networks are webs, they're connections. And when it comes to learning mathematics, learning things in isolation, our brains are not wired to do that. They're wired to learn things as a web. And if you're teaching things in isolation, you're really not making the best use of the kids' natural abilities. And our brains want to connect stuff. They want to understand how things hang together. So the neuroscience basically says, look, our brains are naturally wired to do this. And when we talk about sort of teaching for conceptual understanding, what that really looks like from a neural perspective is you've built a web around these ideas that is rich with sort of crisscrossed networks about how this thing connects. Basically, conceptual understanding of math literally means you've built this connected web in your brain and you understand how all these things hang together. So if you're teaching in a manner that builds those connections, you're basically applying neuroscience to your classroom, right? That's fundamentally what that revolves around. If you're teaching in a way, and obviously it's easy to get, I mean, I was there. I was a high school math teacher. I was confronted with, here's your list of standards that you need to cover this year. We're constantly confronted by material curriculum that is broken into sort of bite-sized chunks, into lists, and it's very easy to get stuck into, well, I covered that bit, great, check, done, we move on, and not sort of teach in a way that leads kids through this sort of journey, through this material that builds a set of connections, right? And it's that, if you like, that challenge that when we're talking about applying neuroscience to the learning process, it's how can we consistently, and then from our perspective, how can we build tools to help teachers consistently bring kids through that kind of connected journey versus, okay, we've done method A, we've done method B, we've done method C, and the kids are like, great, I know how to do these three things. And then if you ask them a question that slightly differs from how they're used to answering, they have no idea because they didn't learn any connections, right? And obviously this has then huge relevance to where we're going with AI and all this kind of stuff. So while this may feel like background, this is actually very relevant to the discussion at hand. So
Yeah, I mean, as I think about a long time ago, my own experience in math, but I think it's not changed a lot today. You spend a lot of time doing problem sets, and then you get the chance, the opportunity to then do a word problem. And, that's sort of the way that you learn a concept in algebra all the way through calculus. And, if you put it into a real world scenario like that, which is the experience of many students, I can see why you would argue that there's not a lot of connections being built amongst knowledge at that point.
Right. And there's also another big challenge with that, which is that it's almost like you only get the chance as a student to do some thinking once you've been told every possible way of doing something. And then once you've done that, maybe you get a chance to answer a question that pushes you a little bit further and maybe asks you to sort of think a little outside the box. And the challenge, of course, for a vast number of students is if you've basically been taught, think within the box, think within the box, think within the box, and then suddenly, right at the very end of the last question of the last chapter, it's like, hey, here's this out-of-the-box question. Well, it's not surprising that for a lot of kids, that's just not going to happen, right? It's like, and one of the big shifts, and we're seeing this in an exciting way in things like in the California framework, as they're moving to this idea of big ideas, and there's language in the framework that explicitly states they want kids to be grappling with what they're calling the big ideas and what we would call, from a neuroscience perspective, schema, right? They want them to be grappling with these, and they say it, and it's such a great sentence, before they have been explicitly taught the procedures and mechanisms to help them do so, right? It's almost like it is worth getting kids to tackle problems and things that are tricky before teaching them how to do all the individual bits, and having that chance to sort of mess with something, even if you're not successful, even if you don't quite get to figure it all out, actually serves you in good stead then when someone does teach you all the bits, because you've kind of got a framework upon which now to hang these things, right? Even if you weren't successful, you're like, oh, right, now I see how that bit would have helped me to do this thing that I was trying to do earlier. And obviously one of the challenges is if language is your only mechanism of asking an interesting question, well, that in and as of itself has huge barriers. And this obviously then brings this focus to visual, where can we ask questions without a language that enable kids to do that thinking before they have to be taught all of the bits, right? So all these things kind of come together in that kind of piece. But yes, that is the traditional way of doing it, is don't think, I'm going to teach you how to do all these little bits. Once we've done all the little bits, maybe you'll get a chance to do a couple of questions that you know, pull it all together. And if we can't do those, don't worry too much. As long as you can do all the little bits, you'll be fine, right? And you'll probably still pass the exam, even if you can't do the tough word problems. You can probably still get a B or something. It's kind of how it goes. And that's doing, kids are capable of so much more thinking than that. They really are. It's like when you get down to it and you remove some of those barriers to thinking, it's surprising what kids are actually capable of doing once you unleash it. But unleashing it is a tricky thing to do. It's not easy.
Yeah, you know, one of the, I don't speak on math a lot like you do, but one of the examples that I use with my students a lot is the number of years that it took me to pass college algebra and doing fundamental things like the linear and quadratic equation and learning that in isolation. And it was not until I took a statistics course and realized that you could have meaningful insight by using those two equations and understanding how variables work in the world. All of a sudden I had, you know, as you said, I had connections for what was previously a very abstract, isolated concept. And it was life-changing for me, literally. And it happened well into adulthood. What would happen if we did those types of things much earlier for a student?
Absolutely. And I think that's really the point, isn't it? It's like, can we teach kids in a way that kind of does that constantly, right? So it's not just even the occasional happenstance of, oh my gosh, this finally made sense. Just that there's, you know, we want them to be heavy into the sense making of things, but then also we want them to feel that their sense making then has had a place. Like, oh right, yeah, I made sense of this, I figured it out, and here's why. I see how this hangs together. And it's not always that needs to be real world connected at all in any way, shape. It just needs to be in some kind of context where it makes sense, you know. So I sometimes get a little bit wary where it's like the only way it makes sense is when you see it in the real world. Yeah, that can be, but math is, after all, this beautiful, incredible abstract construct that you know, it can absolutely hang in its own space. But even within that, you can give kids problems and things to solve that suddenly start making sense and everything connects. But your experience there is really pertinent. It's that notion that you learn this stuff and it's almost like it lay dormant in some way, sense, or like you could do it, but why, who knows? And then suddenly you had an experience where, oh, it all connected. And that is literally in your brain, literal connections being made between synapses, right? Like our brains actually do grow these connections, and once you make those connections, they don't kind of go away, right?
Yeah,
Once
yeah.
you've built them, it's strong. And when you've learned something like that for yourself, when you have personally had that experience of making a connection, that's now learned. You've got it. It's there and it's done. And that's, we sort of have a phrase that kind of talks to that. Mathematics needs to be experienced, not explained. And what you've had there is exactly that moment where you've had this experience. And the reason that experience is so key is that because you had it, you made the connection. No one had to. Someone may well have literally told you that those things were important, or that those many, many, many times. But because you didn't have that connection
Yeah.
for yourself, it's just like, whatever, who cares? And it really is that the kids need to have those experiences themselves that build the web, build the connection, and all that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, this was no deep insight on my part. My stats teacher literally said, "Do you all remember the linear equation you learned in algebra?" And she went on from there, and it was like light bulbs just went off. I
right,
mean,
right.
that's why I was learning it. Let's make a transition and start to talk about artificial intelligence. Before we talk about its uses in the math classroom, one of the things that I think is interesting when we now throw around the term AI as if it's,
Yeah.
as if it's sitting out there on our desk every day, which it is, in our pockets even. But we don't really take time to understand how AI works from sort of a machine learning standpoint. I would make an argument that the reason why AI is so applicable to mathematics is that the underlying models, even though they're called language models, are really based on mathematics, right?
I mean, to a large degree, yes. I mean, there's basically logic models that sort of underpin everything, which fundamentally are mathematical in their nature, or is logic math, or is math logic? Who knows? But yes, fundamentally, there's an architecture there that is inherent. I mean, obviously, mathematics has played a huge role in the development of AI for all of those reasons. So yes, in some ways, mathematics is something that an AI can do somewhat because of its nature, but actually the way that it ends up tackling most of the problems is more connected to sort of the large language model type of thing and being able to be trained on the body of work that's out there, much the same as anything else. I think one of the incredibly powerful things of AI is that despite what substrata it's written on, it is actually applicable to almost anything that it can be trained on. So, but yes, I'm sure there's a certain affinity for mathematical thinking that makes sense to an AI because of the way that it's kind of built.
Yeah.
Yes.
So a lot of people that maybe have been casual observers of AI have started to pay significant attention to it in the last 2 years because of the release of ChatGPT and now the evolution and then the explosion of different apps. There is a longer time frame to this. In your career, working with educational technology and specifically in the field of math, how have you seen AI or machine learning systems evolve over time?
So interesting. I mean, I guess there are sort of multiple phases of use cases of this stuff, right? So earlier use cases, really even predating ChatGPT, were sort of large-scale data analysis. So we've actually been using that in terms of large-scale data analysis for some time internally at Mind, more in terms of then analyzing the efficacy of certain parts of a program versus others and that kind of thing. So that kind of use has been around for a long time. Obviously, with ChatGPT and these kind of commercially available things, that has caused a lot of change. And, I sort of have a few interesting anecdotes, and some of which is almost like pre-AI, but sort of AI. But, there for quite a while now, there have been programs where basically you can take your phone, hold it over any math problem, take a picture of it, and sort of hit the do button, and the program will spit out the perfect answer to sort of the math problem that you've just taken a photograph of. And that's been around for quite some time. And obviously, maybe at the elementary school level, that isn't quite such an issue. But at the middle and high school level, depending upon the content that is being set for kids to do, that changes everything. If all they have to do is point and click, and suddenly all the answers are right there. Now, whether that's good, bad, well, there's different aspects to that, but it certainly changes the nature of what a homework set looks like, for example, and what is the point and purpose of a homework set
Yeah.
if that sort of technology is available. And then, in the last sort of few years, attending various sort of, math sort of related events, you just see a proliferation of sort of everybody saying, here's our program now with AI, now with AI. And it feels like there's not a huge degree of thought as to what that actually means, just that everyone has to say, we now have AI in our program for some reason
Yeah.
or another. But I remember well one of my son's friends in 5th grade using an app to do her homework. And it's just, a little sad, because obviously the learning process for her by doing this was zero. It was just a means to an end of like, well, I have to get this homework done. Okay, great. I understand nothing of what I'm doing, but here are the answers, and that's good. And then we see other uses of AI. I happened to be visiting a school that will remain nameless, and it was actually my son will hopefully go there next year, and he will still go there despite what I observed when I went. But I was going as a parent, going on a tour, and so it's high school. And, so you can imagine if you're a teacher and you have a class and you know that you've got 30 or so prospective parents coming through the school, you're probably going to put on your good lesson, right? You're going to do something that you feel is like, yeah, this is going to be a rocking lesson. And it was a social studies class, probably 10th grade. And they were doing medieval alchemy. And medieval alchemy is a pretty interesting topic. I mean, people got burned at the stake. Isaac Newton was more interested in alchemy than he was in calculus. He thought that was, like whatever. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, but it was a pretty dry lesson. There was a text that the class had to read, and they were kind of reading it half-heartedly, and most of the kids looked like they were half asleep. So the teacher sort of said, okay, I know what we're going to do. We're going to have AI Snoop Dogg read our text for us, right? So whereupon AI Snoop Dogg sort of came on the screen with this medieval alchemy text and is like, yo, what's up? And starts reading this thing. The kids paid attention for about 3 milliseconds longer than they otherwise would have done. And I think there was one moment where AI Snoop Dogg said the word substances, which caused the class to sort of go into sort of white peals of laughter. And that was it. And it just sort of brought home to me this notion that just because it says AI on the tin does not mean that the educational experience is in any way richer than it was before. At the end of the day, kids interacting with a text in that sort of manner, it makes no difference whether you have AI Snoop Dogg or whoever it is reading it. They're not interacting with it in a way that is actually producing any meaning or doing anything. They're not being challenged by it. And that's the issue. We have this tendency in education to kind of gravitate to really simple applications of technology that really don't fundamentally change the educational paradigm.
Yeah.
And the problem here is it's such a big miss, because the potential for changing the paradigm of the way that we, shifting from teaching to learning, if you like, is massive. And one of the challenges I see a lot is that a lot of the applications of AI at the moment in education, in the space, in math and in other areas, are kind of doing the same thing that a lot of other sort of tech innovations have done in the past. They're still just focused on replicating existing practices and say, oh, well, now we can do this a little bit cheaper and better. And okay, great. Okay, great, it can grade all the homework faster, or it can, we can have a program that can give kids adaptive practice. And that's great, we could do that anyway. And now it's called AI adaptive practice. Okay, great. I mean, at the end of the day, kids having practice materials was never really a big part of the problem, right? Right? You said that the whole point that the traditional way of teaching was to give kids worksheets full of problems. So the fact that the worksheet is now adaptive or now has AI
Hmm.
adaptivity doesn't change the fact that you're still basically just giving kids a worksheet. You're not changing the fundamental nature of the way that they're learning. And there's nothing wrong with practice. Practice is a totally good thing, and having practice that then the teacher doesn't have to grade, that's cool. It's a totally fine use, but it's not changing the educational
Yeah.
paradigm, right? It's just replacing a piece of it with technology and makes it a little bit easier and simpler to implement. But we can do so much more. I mean, really, that type of use case of this technology is just feels like a big miss in many, many ways.
Yeah, it's performative in some ways. Although I got to tell you, for the rest of the afternoon, I'm going to be playing with Snoop Dogg AI.
Of course,
I have
absolutely.
performance evaluations with direct reports coming up. It's going to be great.
Only way to go. I mean,
Yeah.
it is funny. Don't get me wrong. It was awesome, and I thought, oh, this is great. But it was just another, and it's similar to. I remember, for example, now when I was in the classroom, I had a smart board or whatever,
Hmm.
I think Promethean board, whatever, in my classroom. I think in 2002, which was awesome, or 2003 certainly, and loved it, and it was great. And then I remember a few years later sort of seeing that the most popular shared lessons on, they had like a sort of website where your
Hmm.
teachers could share materials, was basically a Jeopardy quiz game for smart boards
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
kids could throw a beanbag at the board. And it's like this incredible interactive technology, which allows for all sorts of interactive problem solving, interesting things, is being used basically as a glorified quiz machine. And it's that
Yeah.
same, we keep doing this where we apply technology, and it's like having kids take multiple choice quizzes was not the problem, right? That was easy to do before. Now we've made it a little easier and a bit more fun, but yeah, that's still multiple choice quizzes are not the greatest thing in the world, right? Again, there's some value there, but we keep sort of going after these aspects of it that they're easy to do, they're cheap to build, but
Yeah.
they're not really applying this technology in a useful or interesting way.
So, let's turn the corner and think about the future. If we fundamentally wanted to be able to take advantage of the, rapid evolution of AI in our lives, how might that start to change the paradigmatic approaches to the way that we teach mathematics or any other concept?
So yeah, and I think this is where it starts to get interesting. So one of the things that we've sort of done a lot of and built a lot of is obviously we have a heavy sort of game-based learning,
Hmm.
or problem puzzle-based learning, I guess would be a good way of sort of thinking about it, which is very visual, which is another whole topic. AI actually really struggles with visual problem
Yeah.
solving versus word-based problem solving. AI will solve almost any word problem you choose to put in it, and it really kind of struggles sometimes with things that are very visual, which
Hmm.
little hint for high school and middle school teachers: if your kids are doing all their homework using AI, give them problems with no words in it, and you may find that they suddenly have to start thinking, right? Which is an interesting piece there.
Hmm.
But one of the interesting use cases, and this is something we started doing some R&D into a while back, but didn't really have the tools at the time to sort of go further. But getting classroom discourse going, getting kids to discuss things is massive. Really, really, again, a really important part of the learning process. And one of the things it does, when you have to explain something, it forces you to actually strengthen and make connections in your
Yeah.
brain, right? It actually, like, you get better at understanding stuff from having to explain it. And one of the, now obviously, getting classroom to discussion to occur is not a trivial thing to do for a teacher
Hmm.
in a classroom. It's actually not, always easy to do. And we have sort of started looking at ways of how can we use sort of machine response to students, either spoken or written, sort of responses to things. And we're able to do that very well right now, sort of with visual gameplay, where kids, they try something out and then we animate a response to what they're trying to do. So we're able to do that very, very well with visuals at the moment, where the machine can be a major part of the feedback. And then you can have a class discussion once all the kids have had a few rounds of kind of trying to do stuff by themselves. And the notion that you could now take that a little further, where kids are able to not just sort of respond, if you like, to visual prompts, but respond by trying out what it's like to try and explain something. And maybe their first few attempts are not that great, but with some kind of AI response, you could probably ramp up their attempts to the point where it's like, okay, now they have something meaningful. Now it's actually worth having a class time discussion of actually having the kids sharing what they've got. So you could use that to sort of almost like scale up the responses of students and then have a deeper, richer classroom discussion once kids have kind of gotten through the first few hurdles of trying to respond to things. So there's a whole host of things that you can do, but it's almost like, how can you use this tool to increase the depth of the human level interactions, not use this tool to decrease the depth of the interactions. And I think it's very possible to do that type of thing. And we did experiment with some of that, but this is way before we had sort of easily available AI tools, and it actually worked pretty well, even in the limited way we were able to do that. But there are, I think, potentials of doing something exponentially better now. I worry about using the word exponentially like that because it's not used precisely mathematically.
Right.
It's all good.
One of the things that you said that, because of my professional background, that I think is so important is the idea of allowing students opportunities to verbalize knowledge. And in fact, going all the way back to my PhD program, we've heard in popular press about learning styles. You hear that term thrown around a lot, sure. Right? I don't buy into that a whole bunch, but there are really compelling research studies that we accumulate different types of knowledge, one of which is declarative knowledge, which just means that I can talk about what I know. And I agree with you that if you reach that level of knowledge where students can declare, this is what I think I see happening here, that is a level of knowledge that goes far beyond rote memorization.
Right.
Another analogy that I would use that maybe would be meaningful for listeners that aren't as much into math or statistics is, if you've ever coached a athletic team like basketball, you can have players run a play over and over again in practice, and they will do it to a level of precision that you're happy with, and you get into a game where the environment's different and they completely forget what they're supposed to do, right? If you use your practice time to have them coach each other on running that same play, in other words, teaching it, it dramatically changes how they internalize not what they're supposed to do, but why they're doing it, because they're explaining that. I think that's very similar, right?
I think that's remarkably similar. I love the fact that you're using some sport analogies here. I do this all the time. So my son plays soccer, plays for a elite academy team, so I get to watch this whole sort of training thing, and I've watched this happen over the last few years. And I'm constantly bringing sport metaphors and references into blogs and talking about mathematics learning and sort of, in various ways. I think what you've got there is one that I haven't seen or used before, but I think it's a great one because, again, from a neuroscience point of view, what you're having the kids do during their practice time is actually, it's not like they don't know the things that you're trying to get them to do, right? It's just they know how to pass. They know the mechanics of all these things. What you're trying to get them to do is put it together. Mm-hmm. And one way is to do it so many times that it's almost like the pure muscle memory of it takes over and you can't forget it. But like you said, in a game, that all falls apart. And the reason being is that what happens in a game, your working memory, which you only have a very limited amount of, is now suddenly full of, oh my God, there are lights, there are people, there's a game, what the heck, and we're losing 15, whatever. And suddenly, if you were using working memory during that drill to be successful as you kind of did that practice, well, now your working memory is totally used up. It's done, right? Yeah. And you forget the most simple, basic things. I've been there, done it. I actually was on stage once with a magician, and I could not add numbers together. And he brought me up on stage specifically. It was at a conference, and it was like, and for some reason, I just my I'm used to being on stage, but for some reason that day, whatever, it just like something kind of hit, and I couldn't think. Right, it's just like my working memory would not
Yeah.
allow me to add some four-digit numbers to it. Couldn't. It was the most bizarre feeling, and that's what happens to a lot of kids when they haven't really built any underlying understanding of what they're trying to do. They're relying upon this surface level processing to kind of help them through. And this now, by talking it through, by having to explain it to somebody else, they're deepening that understanding. They're bringing it in. They're internalizing it, quite literally, sort of internalizing it in their brains, so that then when they come to do it, it's not all running up on the surface. It's actually now coming from a deeper place. So that's a lovely analogy of then seeing that happen with kids in sports. And same thing mathematically. Yeah, if you get kids in the classroom to have to explain things to each other, and I think this is one of the hard things for teachers to let go of. There will be times when you hear explanations that are not perfect, right? They're not going to be right. And you kind of need to let that play out a little bit. And then, okay, well, let's try that. And then we see, that didn't quite work because how can we modify that to change? But you have to let kids get that stuff out, because if one student is saying something that they think is correct that turns out ultimately to be incorrect, you've probably already told them the right way, but that's what they've internalized.
Yeah.
And they're probably not the only one. Probably 90% of the other kids are thinking that same thing. So it's so much better to hear what they're thinking and then kind of go, okay, let's work with that. Let's let that run a little bit. And then we see, oh, right, that didn't work. Now we've got to change it. And again, for the students, that's such a more powerful learning process to kind of be in control, to go, well, I think it should be this. We should try this. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, my gosh. They're never going to try that again. Whereas if you've told them and then it was wrong, and then you say, no, you should do it like this, 3 days later, they're going to go exactly back to what they were doing before, because they didn't have for themselves that experience of saying it, seeing it was wrong, and having to readjust their thinking. So I know as a teacher, it's so much easier to think, well, if I just tell them the right thing and I keep telling them the right thing and I keep doing it here and I keep it contained, surely that's better. But actually, no, they need to express, to say, to try, to do, and to fail. That process, So yes.
I've got two final questions for you. I'm going to throw them both out because they're interrelated. So the first question is: are there particular AI tools that you find yourself gravitating towards in a regular basis? And then the second part of the question is, if there are teachers out there that are wanting to start learning how to experiment with the things we've been talking about, are there suggestions you would have for particular apps or tools that they should start familiarizing themselves with?
Yeah, I think so in terms of AI things, most of the stuff that I might use would on a regular basis at this point is very much productivity oriented things. And that's not even necessarily so much educational related, but, like podcasting apps like this one, for example, are really, really good for doing that. As you mentioned, I am in a band, and I still am in a band, and we actually do use this to generate content. And so that type of app to be used for sort of, whether it's podcasting or making documents or whatever, productivity-oriented things, I think, that's becoming relatively ubiquitous, and I think, no issue there. From an educational perspective, I haven't really seen a whole lot. I mean, AI Snoop Dogg notwithstanding, obviously the greatest thing. And let me just make sure this is clear. I love Snoop Dogg. I thought Snoop Dogg's Olympic thing was just the most awesome stuff ever. But unfortunately, it didn't make medieval alchemy come to life any more than anything else. And I think just sort of hypothesizing for a moment, there are things that aren't existing yet. But for example, there are AI apps that can make photographs, static images, actually move a little bit and come to life. And I imagine from a historical perspective, being able to sort of, see images from Pompeii, for example, actually start move and come to life and start visualizing what life could have been. There's all sorts of interesting things that could happen with that. I don't think we're there yet. People haven't necessarily built all of those types of things. From more of the learning perspective, I think it's more a question of, never mind whether it's AI or not AI, how can, from a teaching perspective, that shift from how am I teaching to how are they learning is the most fundamental important thing to sort of make a move on. Just thinking about what tools can you use as a teacher or as an administrator to help teachers use that can actually be starting to focus on kids sort of engaging in a process. And, obviously at Mind Research, we do have a whole ton of stuff for math, some of which is freely available. We have these whole things called Puzzle Talks, which are out there, which anybody can use, which basically take interactive games, bring them into the classroom, and have classroom discussions based around those things. So it's a small moment that allows that kind of piece to occur. But that, there's plenty of other tools that do that thing. Mm-hmm. It's more a mindset of, and I think this is the bigger thing. If teachers and the educational community as a whole starts changing the mindset away from, oh, what's the shiniest, brightest, newest AI tool that basically is going to make everything a lot easier, to, what are the tools, whether they're AI or not, that can actually really start students and push them on this path of thinking, that's going to have a bigger outcome than necessarily, like a particular tool or this, that, and the other. It really is, how can we shift the emphasis to be student thinking, students being challenged, especially in mathematics? Because, certainly some of the blogs that I've written over the last year or so have all fundamentally been kind of talking about a similar thing, where if kids are coming out of math class today purely able to do some procedural mathematics, the value of that skill today is literally zero. Yeah. Just absolutely zero. We all have phones in our hands that can even solve all the word problems we might be asked. Just being able to do procedural sort of competency used to be really valuable. My mother, part of her job as the secretary back in the day, office manager, she'd be called now, being able to be good at doing mathematical procedures was a useful skill, right? That actually was a significant part of her employment. That is just no longer the case. The skills that are needed are critical thinking. They are the ability to look at that word problem at the back of the book and actually look at it and at first go, I don't know what to do, but not be afraid of that, and to actually go, let's figure it out. And you don't get there by basically only asking that question once every couple of months. Right? You get there when that is the daily process of learning, where kids are immersed in a learning environment where commonly they are hit with, okay, here's this new thing. How are we going to figure it out? Well, let's figure it out together. Let's get in there and do that. And then obviously that changes their mindset, and the outcomes are very different. So yes, we build tools for that. That's kind of what we do. But there's plenty of good stuff out there. It's a question of building that discernment, I think, is the biggest.
And being strategic and thinking about it.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Yeah.
Nigel, my conversations with you are always insightful and fun. Thank you for giving me your time today.
Total pleasure.
My guest today has been Nigel Nisbet. He's the Vice President of Content Creation for the Mind Research Institute in Irvine, California. We will have a link to the Mind Institute if you would like to learn more about some of the concepts that Nigel's been talking about and just the work that the Mind Institute does. Thank you for listening to Teaching Matters. Special thanks to April Koska and Trinity Sweet, who do all the things behind the scene to make me look smart on screen. And if you want to reach out to the podcast with ideas, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to email us at teachingmatterspodcast, all one word, all lowercase, at ohio.edu. Teaching Matters Podcast at ohio.edu. Thanks for listening. I hope you have a great day.